Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. This is the Grantees presentation for the 6th edition of the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Greater China Research Grant. This grant is organized by Asia Archive and is generously supported by the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation, since 2013. The 3 grantees of the 6th edition of the grant are Zhuang Wubin, Deng Liwen, and Zeng Qunkai. Our event today will be 3 hours. Each of the grantees will have a 1-hour section to present their work that's relevant to the grant, as well as a conversation with our moderators and the public. So the first section will be Zhuang Wubin, who will talk about his project with the title of Resurfacing Hong Kong in Southeast Asia, Circulations of Photography from the 1930s to the Handover. Wubin himself is a photographer. He's also a researcher and writers and curators on photography who is based in Singapore. The moderator for Wubin's talk will be Qunkai Vu, our colleagues in Asia Archive, and Qunkai is responsible for the research in Southeast Asia. So let's welcome Wubin.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Should I start my presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank, before I begin, actually, I would like to thank AAA, Hong Kong Heritage Museum, 𝗪𝗵𝘂𝗪𝗂𝗪, and also the National Library Board of Singapore for actually helping me facilitate my research. Today I'm going to present the report that I've written for the grant. Let me share screen. I have quite a lot of, I wrote actually quite a long presentation, so let me go straight for the chase. And today I'm just going to talk very specifically about one aspect of the research actually. So basically the report that I've presented, right, has actually 2 sections. In the first section, what I've tried to do is actually to look at materials that emanate and emerged from Southeast Asia and to see how Hong Kong had been or has been portrayed in relation to the circulations of photography. And I mean, you know, the circulation of ideas, visuals, periodicals, printing technology, camera technology, etc. So the first section actually deals with a kind of like an overview of reviewing these materials. Like so, and these materials are such materials are not isolated as well. Using the archive of digital newspaper, the digital archive of newspapers from Singapore and Malaya, right? You actually quite often chance upon articles like this where, you know, Hong Kong was held up as a kind of like reference point for salon photographers or photographers from Southeast Asia. So 𝗪𝗔 𝗂𝗵𝘂𝗪 is a very popular writer and photographer from Singapore, and this was actually a report that he filed when he went to Hong Kong and then came back. Also in, let's say, the first Pan-Malayan photography exhibition organized by the Singapore Camera Club, you see actually in the jury, let's say in the report of one of the jury members, right? Again, Hong Kong was raised as a kind of reference point for the Malayan photographers. And also looking at exhibition catalogs. So obviously this is from Sabah, and looking at advertisements, in fact. So you see actually the specter of Hong Kong, you know, publications coming from Hong Kong being sold in a place in Sabah, in a city called Sundarkan, which actually has an old connection with Hong Kong. Basically, the section 2 of my report is concerns periodicals, using periodicals as method or as source materials to try to resurface Hong Kong within Southeast Asia. And in general, I looked at 4 periodicals. The first is actually Chinese photography. And then I looked at photo art, which actually existed for 2 periods, but I'm primarily interested in the first period, 1960 to 1963. I looked at world photography, 𝗔𝘀𝗶𝗃 𝗂𝗂𝗃, which existed from 1952 to 1958. And then I looked at the iconic photo pictorial, which existed from 1964 to 2005, nearly half a century. I'm going to talk a little bit more on these periodicals a little bit on in the presentation, but I want to just say that in my work, I typically differentiate between 2 types of periodicals. One is what I would call a photo periodical, which is a periodical that primarily reports on photographic practices which primarily reports on photographic practices. And there's a second kind of periodical that I'm also interested in, but I have not really dealt with in the report, which is a pictorial periodical, which is or we might call the 𝗭𝗵𝗂, which is really a recurring publication delivering a substantial amount of content using photography and other illustrated means. So you can see that in photo pictorial, with its name, right, it actually gestures towards a kind of move, where it tries to move from being a photo periodical, which reports on photography, into a publication that also tries to communicate content using photographic images. And this is quite a conscious move. Of course, the most famous pictorial periodical would be like the alluring Liang-You, the Young Companion. And of course, in Southeast Asia, we also had a wide variety of pictorial periodicals being made. For instance, this is the Chronicle magazine from the Philippines. I usually like to use, so this is like a way where I try to visualize my understanding of photography. So of course, this is a kind of model that I'm always trying to work on and try to change. But in the middle, you would see actually the participants who partake in photography. And of course, intersecting all these participants is the idea of individual or institutional desires. And of course, the use of photography is affected by the broader milieu. I understand also the practice of photography. The practice of photography takes place through circulations, and I really mean circulations of people, ideas, visuals, capital, camera and printing technologies, and periodicals. So if we pull this idea of circulations out as a factor of this research, I'm primarily interested here to see how circulations produce and negotiated colonialism, nationalism, and Chineseness. For this report, I'm more interested in trying to understand the circulations, with less focus placed on analyzing the photographs and the content. But that does not mean that I do not try to do that, but more emphasis has been placed on looking at the circulations. I just want to say one quick word about Chineseness, which is that I use Chineseness as a kind of analytical category and also a kind of corporal and affective experience that relate to the performative of being Chinese. And also I use it to signify the looming specter of China in Southeast Asia. But I want to stress that I do not feel like there is a need to define it conclusively. And I think that's actually a more productive way of approaching the subject. I'm interested in how Chineseness actually entangles nationalism and Cold War. I thought for the benefit of the presentation today, I would actually tell the story of two straight Chinese men and use their life stories as a way to kind of connect the whole research. The first gentleman is goes by the name of 𝗂𝗵𝘂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂. I would say that he was probably the most well-known photographer from Southeast Asia in the post-war era. His parents were Heng Hua, probably medalists, quite poor, and they were actually recruited to go to Sarawak, to a place called Cebu, and then they became agricultural settlers to open up the forested areas for agriculture. As they say, 𝗂𝗵𝘂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂 got beaten by the camera bug quite early, and then he went to China to apprentice in photography. And in Xiamen, he worked for Anna Studio, and then he brought this name back to Sarawak. So in 1938, when he went back to Sarawak, he opened a studio in Cebu, Anna Studio in Kuching in 38, and then 41 he opened another Anna Studio in Cebu. So this studio would become one of the most famous photo studios in Southeast Asia. But he's he's not actually unique, but he also had a parallel career in amateur photography or salon photography. In 1950, he won, let's say, the first open photography exhibition hosted by the Singapore Art Society. So his image is actually on the right. And he won the silver medal for pictorial work that year, and which was actually at that year the highest award given for pictorial work. And that was also the occasion where he met Malcolm McDonald. You see Malcolm McDonald here, well-known patron, was at the time Commissioner General for Southeast Asia. And then he would develop a lasting relationship with this British colonial officer. And starting from 47 until 1980s, his work actually appeared regularly in publications around the world, and one of which was actually Straits Times Annual. We have to remember that Straits Times Annual at that time was a very well-produced pictorial periodical, which circulated in not just in Singapore, Malaya, but also in the Anglophone world. And very quickly, his work was being published on Chinese photography. So we come to the first publication that was published post-war in Hong Kong, the first photo periodical being published post-World War II in Hong Kong. So you can see his work being published here. And I just want to point out the fact that his work was, his images are actually misrepresented in this small little spread, because it was supposed to be a focus on Malaya, but you see images from Bali, from East Java being placed within this this framework. I'm not so sure whether it was 𝗂𝗵𝘂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂 who made the mistake or whether the editors of Chinese photography made the mistake. But anyway, there was a misrepresentation in terms of place. Later on, his first photo book was actually published in London in 1960, called *The Pagan Innocents*. Let me come back and speak very quickly about Chinese photography. I'll just only say something very briefly. The main figurehead for Chinese photography was Francis Wu. As you can see from the title itself, the periodical tried to speak to or speak on behalf of Chinese photographers. But we can say that the timing, and it was actually a largely bilingual publication. We can sense a certain ambition in such a publication. But talk about bad timing, because the periodical was actually established. The first issues were published in 1950, 1 year after the founding of New China, which meant that it became harder to get materials coming from China. And it also became harder for such a publication to circulate back to China, losing an important market of readers in that way. So Chinese photography died in 1 year. The second person that would thread this entire presentation is somebody that I think people from Hong Kong would be slightly more familiar. His name is called 𝗔父李 or 𝗵父旂. He's actually a 𝗔𝗀𝗀𝗃 or Teochew. And very young, like some of the Teochew migrants, he sought for working opportunities in Siam. So he went to actually Nakhon Phanom. Then later on, he went to Hanoi. And then it was in Vietnam that he set up his 𝗤𝗨 company. And 1951, he won his first Salon awards. But actually, he was also very closely connected to the first series of art photo exhibitions in Vietnam. In 1952, 1953, and 1954, centered primarily in Hanoi. There was a series of 3 annual art photography exhibitions. It was ostensibly the first attempt by photographers across the Indochina colony, so incorporating also photographers from Cambodia, to exhibit their works, to organize an exhibition, exhibit their works. And 𝗵𝗂𝗪 was actually involved in the 3 exhibitions. I should point out that there were Chinese photographers in this framing of Vietnam art photography. So this is 1953, submission of 𝗵𝗂𝗪 on the right, and this is 1954. And very quickly, he was, well, the activities of photographers in Vietnam was reported in World Photography magazine. So this is January 1953 issue. They ran a report on 越南的摄影界动态, which is the development of Vietnamese photography. It's a brief overview of Vietnamese photography, which only focused on Chinese photographers in Vietnam and Cambodia. Presumably, it means that they felt that there were no, or they were not aware that there were important Vietnamese or Khmer photographers working at that time. I would want to say a little bit about World Photography, which is a magazine that I'm really interested in. It's actually, it was probably the longest photo periodical in existence during the 1950s. It existed from 1953 to 1958. Let me go back, sorry. And actually, it's published by World Publishing Company in Hong Kong. And World Publishing Company actually originated from the World Book Company, which was actually a company opened by Zhou Xingchu in Singapore, actually, in 1934. So under his, let's say, book publishing businesses, he had actually World Book Company and then Popular Book Company. So these were actually bookstores that were opened by him. And in 1949, he opened the World Publishing Company, and that was actually the publisher in Hong Kong that was responsible for publishing World Photography. And because it actually had a Nanyang or Southeast Asia connection, it actually enjoyed the distribution channel that the World Book Company and Popular Bookstore had. So you can see an issue of World Photography being distributed across Southeast Asia, in Jakarta, in Surabaya, definitely in Singapore, Penang, Kuala Lumpur, and also in Bangkok. And all these locations actually point to, so these are locations within the respective Chinatowns of the major cities. And here also you will see K.F. Wong's work. So K.F. Wong's work was constantly being featured on all these photo periodicals. So K.F. Wong's work on the left. And one thing that was quite striking is that because it actually enjoyed, well, the publisher enjoyed a connection with Southeast Asia, a very close connection with Southeast Asia. He was always able to report on, in some detail, the developments of photography in all the different cities across Southeast Asia. So on your right, you will see actually a report on the forming of the Sundarkan Photographic Society at that time in British North Borneo. And this report actually makes clear the imprint of Hong Kong as a reference point for the setting up of the Sundarkan Photographic Society, which would then become the Sabah Photographic Society. This is actually a way where I'm trying to visualize, let's say, the social life and the circulation of a Chinese periodical. And I'm trying to use this to perhaps think about the circulations of such a periodical post-1949 and then after the creation of Two Vietnams in 1954. And you will see that I think post-1949, the connection with mainland became lesser and the connection with Southeast Asia became much more stronger. Hong Kong was not a major, Hong Kong did not provide a major market for readership. Readership for a Chinese periodical typically comes from Southeast Asia. But after 1954, when when Vietnam was partitioned, when Two Vietnams was created, Democratic Republic of Vietnam had a certain kind of control over the kind of publications that would come into the North. but at the same time, it also enjoyed a direct relationship with China. So a periodical like China Pictorial 人民画报 would be possible to read it in the north directly, not going through Hong Kong. Whereas here, this connection is actually through Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong publications, I think, post 1954 would have some challenge in entering the north of Vietnam. Coming back to 𝗵𝗂旂, in 1955, after the forming of the Republic of Vietnam, he decided to relocate to Hong Kong. Instead of staying put, right, to serve the socialist remaking of the north, he decided not to do that. Neither did he move to 𝗪 Kiet, which is Laos, where his brother was based. And unlike many of the overseas Chinese who were based in Southeast Asia, who went back to help the socialist remaking of China, he decided to go to Hong Kong. And of course, it's quite a strategic move, because only in Hong Kong, under the protection of British colonialism, would he be able to maintain his business. And then in 1958, he set up the Chinese Photographic Association of Hong Kong. 1959, K.F. Wong was featured in a solo exhibition. So you can see constantly K.F. Wong being the most well-known photographer representing Southeast Asia. 1959, also 𝗵𝗂旂 was invited, he began to be invited to go back to China and photograph her scenery. By the end of 1970s, he already became a member of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. 𝗵𝗂旂 was actually involved in two important photo periodical, and there is a very close connection between the two periodicals. I will spend a bit more time talking about photo art. As I said, I'm focusing primarily in the first period, 1960 to 63. So these are the members that was involved. 𝗵𝗂旂 was the publisher editor. Mark Fong was involved as well, but his name was only listed much later. Li-Ching was also involved, but he was never identified. I'll come back briefly about Li-Ching. So he was actually involved in founding, supporting, perhaps even funding the photo art. And by the time photo art came about, there was already no pretense of, so 𝗵𝗂旂 didn't try to speak on behalf of the Chinese photographers anymore. So he was quite clearly speaking to and on behalf of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. So in the same issue where the inauguration speech, he talks about Hong Kong and Southeast Asia together, speaking to and on behalf of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. But in the same issue at the end, the closing editorial, right, which was written by S.F. Dunn, right, Hong Kong went back into, fell back into the framing of Southeast Asia. So it was not really necessary for him to mention Hong Kong separately from Southeast Asia. So you can see actually Hong Kong slipping in and out even within the same issue of photo art. And of course, very quickly in the second issue of photo art, K.F. Wong's work was being printed. And so you can see actually photo art had, in some ways, and I'm proposing this, that they actually learned from what world photography, the experience of world photography. They realized that the main market for Hong Kong periodical was actually in Southeast Asia. So they made no pretense to speak about or on behalf of China or Chinese photographers. So it's an editorial position that's quite different from Chinese photography. So they inherited a bit of what they saw from world photography, and they spoke to and on behalf of Southeast Asia. It's a little bit difficult to understand the reach of photo art, but we can try to guess, because to commemorate its inauguration, Chongdai, I think I'm left with 10 minutes. So to mark its inauguration, photo art organized a contest, and the winners were published. The winning entries were published on the 7th issue, and they received 1,000 prints from all these different territories. The top 5 sources of submissions came from Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Thailand, and Republic of Vietnam. Let's say Nguyen Dan from Republic of Vietnam, which is South Vietnam, won the gold medal in the competition. It's important to note that the Vietnam that they saw in photo art was actually from the south, not really the north. the photographers from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam would have would have trouble submitting to a competition in Hong Kong. So actually Nguyen Mac Dan's work was being featured. And Nguyen Mac Dan actually later on make a very important publication representing the perspective of the South, one of the most important Vietnam War publication. And so you can see actually some of the images that were published in some of the winning submissions published on issue 7. And actually later on, Photo Art might as well just use World Book Company to distribute the periodical into Southeast Asia. And strictly speaking, yes, as I said, the Vietnam that they saw in Photo Art was actually from the South. And strictly speaking, it's not also, even though this is a largely Chinese publication, the photographers that were featured were not only ethnic Chinese photographers from Vietnam. There were a lot of ethnic Vietnamese photographers, so long as they were recognized as exemplars of salon photography. So the criteria was salon photography, and then their works would be featured. So this article, written by 𝗪𝗂𝗯𝗶 actually talked about, you know, the subject of sand dunes, which remains actually a very popular subject in Vietnamese photography. And in the article itself, they mentioned the fact that even Singapore photographers connected Vietnamese photography with the iconography of sand dunes. And so this is a report that is published in Photo Art in 1961, referencing an article published in Singapore in 1960, which talks about Vietnamese photography's connection, or let's say the style of Vietnamese photography, Republic of Vietnam photography, and its connection with the iconography of sand dunes. And of course, this is actually the external validation and the making of Vietnamese photography in work here. Works circulating to Singapore and then being validated there, and then helping to re-entrench and re-visualize Vietnamese photography. And then, of course, revalidation in Photo Art itself. I just want to speak about Chan Pho Lay and the Chineseness of Photo Art. And I think because he's also involved in photo pictorial, but I think this particular issue, issue 20, where there was 2 articles being published, and I think it's quite useful to read these 2 articles conjointly and to get a sense of what was his sense of Chineseness. So even though he was the publisher editor of the magazine, issue 20 was somewhat like a kind of special issue dedicated to him. He wrote a very long article talking about, you know, Chinese painting concepts and landscape photography. And he talked about, let's say, salon photography and how salon photography was still influenced by Western painting. And not very surprisingly, he used the technical limits of photography, because at that time, it was easier to do black and white photography. And then he used that technical limit to connect with the tradition of ink painting. And he argued that in Western painting, right, it was actually informed by linear perspective. Chan felt that sorry, should I end? Okay. How much time do I have left? Okay. So, yeah, okay. So Chan felt that Western painting was informed by linear perspective, and he felt that it was not necessarily the case for photography. And he felt that it was possible actually to do 3点透视, which is multiple vanishing points or multiple point perspective, which would bring photography closer to the aesthetic of painting. And he said that he proposed that in landscape photography, a photographer could do that by just using a wide angle lens, standing halfway up the mountain and photographing the view, where then you would have the, you know, the top view, the bottom view, and then the middle view. And then he also said that you could always do that also in the dark room. And then also in the same issue, at the end, where they put out a kind of like an editorial, it was a kind of response to a very popular magazine at that time called American Photo Periodical, called Photo Pictorial, sorry, Popular Photography. So in its August 1962 issue, Popular Photography from America ran a kind of report on Hong Kong and alleging that some of the doctors who were also amateur photographers had spent money to buy photographs so that they could submit to salon contests. And so apparently the article in Popular Photography also highlighted the excessive competitiveness among Hong Kong photo club members at trying to win awards. And this is actually nothing very surprising because it was already reported. So earlier on, I mentioned this article. It was actually kind of like a well-known fact that some salon photographers in Hong Kong were engaging in malpractice in the sense of commissioning other photographers to make images that they could submit to competitions. And there was always a kind of like urban myth or urban information that Hong Kong photographers were only really interested in people who were accredited or famous as salon photographers. So this is actually nothing surprising. So in the defense of Hong Kong photography, and without trying to investigate, the editorial team of Photo Art actually, and without irony, in fact, tried to defend Hong Kong photography by highlighting precisely the number of awards Hong Kong photographers have won at foreign salons. And also it took a cheap shot at the editor of Popular Photography. So if we read these two articles together, right, we can say that in the first place, in the first article, instead of trying to argue for the autonomy of photographic art, you can see that the basis of the aesthetic framework for 𝗪𝗡 was still painting. What he was essentially arguing for was the replacement of Western painting with Chinese painting or Chinese ink painting as a kind of reference for, you know, Chinese photography or Chinese photographic art. And in defense of, so when we go back and look at the defense of Hong Kong photography, right, in defense of the practice of photography in Hong Kong, the editors actually felt that it was more important to conjure the specter of China instead of cultural Southeast Asia. And in that sense, unwittingly made clear that only the motherland could measure against the Americanism of popular photography. So inevitably, they set up a culture, a hierarchy of cultures, putting China ahead of Southeast Asia. And if we want to pursue it a little bit more, we could probably say that this revealed that their claim on Southeast Asia was actually driven more by market rather than a sense of belonging. And again, and also in defense of Hong Kong photography, they still use their achievements in salon contests in foreign countries as the rationale for popular photography to show respect. But let's not forget one thing. In the first place, Hong Kong photographers like Chan were able to establish their names in salon photography because they chose to live in British Hong Kong, where connections with the rest of the world was maintained, which made it easier for them to submit competitions to different places around the world. And you can see a corresponding example, a negative example of photographers who were based in Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, or in New China, where they would have much more difficulties in terms of circulating their works into these competitions around the world. And I would imagine that if they choose to do that at that point in time, they would probably be tagged as petit bourgeois. So if we read these two articles together, we might say that his Chineseness was actually predicated upon British colonialism and a claim of eternal China. So I have to end in 2 minutes. So I will just highlight the fact that 𝗪𝗡 was later on involved in photo pictorial. Again, 𝗪𝗀𝗃 was the person that was hidden and was supporting from the background, and later on through the work of 𝗪𝗀 Li from Hong Kong, we also know that 𝗪𝗃 had a direct connection with 𝗪𝗱𝗀𝗃, who was the chair of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission, representing the CCP. And so the two publications that he was involved tacitly, Photo Art and Photo Periodical, was actually somewhat directed and supported, and if not funded, by China. So basically, this is just going to, I'm just going to run some images of K.F. Wong. Also, immediately K.F. Wong was, again, extensively published on Photo Pictorial. You see K.F. Wong's image earlier made into a postcard and then circulating L. So it was, this postcard image was actually printed in Ireland, circulated by a company there, and then putting Borneo and Sarawak onto the tourist map. And also 𝗂𝗏 was the exemplary overseas Chinese, right? He revisited China as early as 1975, just 1 year after the resumption of diplomatic relationships or between Malaysia and China. And of course, a lot of the Sarawak photographers, seeing the example of 𝗂𝗏, right, they follow suit. And so they submitted a lot of this kind of indigenous images of indigenous bodies and people into photo pictorial. That there are plenty of such examples, and I will not elaborate. And I'll just maybe end here and say that, you know, for these Chinese photographers who were born or based in Sarawak, it felt as though that the cultures and lives of the Sarawak Chinese were useless and not exotic enough to submit to photo pictorial's regular context. I think I have to stop, so I cannot do the next part of my presentation, but I will be happy to take some questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Wubin, for that really wonderful talk. It was really interesting to see some of the periodicals that you've been looking at. While we wait for the questions to come in, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you to elaborate on certain parts of your presentation. So
okay.
The title of your talk is Resurfacing Hong Kong in Southeast Asia. So I'm very interested in how you see the construction of Chineseness and also constructions of Southeast Asia through the pictorial. Right? So, you know, we had talked briefly about how, you know, this is during a time of massive anti-colonial struggles throughout the region of Southeast Asia. You know, this is also during the time of the post-49 construction of China. And of course, in Hong Kong, it's still a British colony. And so there are all these political forces at play. You allude to this a little bit in your talk about how Chineseness through the pictorial is constructed, you know, in mind with the idea of China. So for example, with ink painting, right? But it's also in relation to certain representations of Southeast Asia. So I'd like to ask if you can speak a little bit more about what are some of the representations of Chineseness that you saw in the periodicals? Like, were there certain common motifs, you know, or certain types of representations that you saw?
So of course, thanks for the question. I think it's not that easy to talk about Chineseness in a kind of like historical vacuum. So that's also the reason why I feel that it's actually more interesting to look at the intersections of Chineseness with, let's say, national culture in Southeast Asia and, you know, co-war culture in Southeast Asia, and even colonial culture in parts of Southeast Asia, which decolonized at a later stage. And one of the key strategies was that, as I think, I'm probably not going to say something very new, but just to say that Hong Kong was the place where different political affinities competed as a kind of, as a space to disseminate their ideologies and their products. However, the different territories across Southeast Asia all had different desires for these products. So the most extreme case would be that they could easily ban certain products coming into Southeast Asia, and which is what happened in 1965 after the Suharto takeover in Indonesia. If we look at photo pictorial, and we look at the recollections of Mark Fong, who is the editor of the photo pictorial, he mentioned quite a few times that Indonesia was one of the major market for them. And when Suharto came into power, the official import of such publications, Chinese publications, in fact, became very difficult. So that was actually the most extreme way where you can control the inflow of a magazine from the perspective of Southeast Asia, and from the perspective of Indonesia. So then we don't really have to talk about Chineseness in relation to the circulation of a periodical. Because the only way you could see that kind of any kind of Chinese publication is if you smuggle it. I just have to, I mean, it's a kind of like detail. We just have to take note that even though there was a ban of Chinese culture across Indonesia, there were certain places where smuggling was still prevalent, right? So especially in Medan, in Sumatra, in Kalimantan, through Sarawak.
So you did show us a lot of photos, for example, of people from Southeast Asia, right? Women, oftentimes half-clad, or ethnic minorities, landscapes. So those there are lots of those types of photos. So certain representations of Southeast Asia. I'm wondering why talk about Hong Kong in relation to Southeast Asia? You talked about it in terms of the market. That Southeast Asia was a very important market for these magazines. But how about in terms of the representation of Chineseness in relation to Southeast Asia? Right? I mean, you do touch upon that in terms of Chineseness in relation to China, mainland China. So what is the role of Southeast Asia in this triangulation of images?
I think, if I understand your question correctly, I was actually just about to say something in relation to the previous question. In other words, any kind of Chineseness that was permitted to be transmitted into Southeast Asia, right, was already mediated by censorship. So many of these periodicals, if they want to, for instance, reach Indonesia or reach Malaya, it had to be sufficiently depoliticized, and that affects Chineseness as well. So very often, what we can see in these periodicals is the dissemination of images like Huangshan or mountainous or just the landscapes of China, instead of anything very specific or concrete about China. However, when you look at the images disseminating from Southeast Asia into these periodicals in Hong Kong, right, you will actually see that, and actually the example of the Sarawak case is quite clear as well. In order for many of these Chinese photographers based in Southeast Asia to get their work noticed, they would often have to go and look for local, let's say local color, which is a maybe euphemism for a kind of like indigenous images. And because they realize very well that that's the kind of image that would actually make it into a periodical in Hong Kong. So and actually they learn from predecessors. They look at the example or the success of K.F. Wong, somebody like K.F. Wong, who is a very successful ethnic Chinese photographer in Sabah. Probably he would be the #1 most famous at that time in Southeast Asia. And they see that by photographing indigenous bodies and indigenous people, that was actually a sure way where their images could be published in Hong Kong. So in that sense, their Chineseness is not apparent in the image that they produce, which is why I say that I think it's a kind of like, it's slightly problematic if we just look at, if we attempt to read these images using a kind of photo history or art history methodology where we focus on the images itself, because that doesn't tell you a lot about the way these images are made and why they are made and how they are circulated. When we move beyond the surface of that image and look at how circulations work, right, we realize that actually it was primarily the Chinese photographers who made these kind of images circulating through Hong Kong and actually everywhere else across Southeast Asia and also the world, making their name. And then these images then became absorbed within the national representation of, let's say, Malaysia or Indonesia or Thailand. And you can see actually quite similar developments in these places.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wubin, you have several questions, so I'm going to ask them. From Anthony, he asked, how connected were the photography communities in different regions in Southeast Asia during the 50s to the 1970s? Was traveling across the region possible?
Well, this is a... I would say that if you're talking about official travel, right? So, meaning not illegal traveling. Actually, the place that I think would have the largest issue would be DRV, in fact, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, because after the creation of two Vietnams in 1954, of course, there was a major exodus of people moving from the north to the south. And there was also another major exodus of people moving from the north back into China. And there was also people moving actually to Hong Kong at that time already. Then also people moving away. After basically the creation of two Vietnams, the connection between the north to the rest of Southeast Asia would become a little bit more challenging. But I think if you look at it from Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, well, Singapore, Malaya, Indonesia, then the connections are still quite open and fluid. You could probably say that that was made possible because of the free Southeast Asia framing. So there were a lot of connections, and in fact, there is actually, especially among photographers, there were a lot of connections between, let's say, Singapore, Malaya, Indonesia, Thailand, people traveling, exhibitions traveling as well.
Okay, Anthony has another question. Do you know how these photographers were trained? Were they trained through formal education? Was it a master apprentice system, or was there another system in place?
I wrote something about this some time back. Actually, it's actually typically I think so salon photography was largely let's say took effect largely through photo clubs. So what the photo clubs would do is that they set up this kind of informal tutelage where you follow a master, or they would organize a trip. All of us would go to a spot and then we would photograph, and then the master photographer or the award-winning photographer would tell you what would be a good competition, what would be a good composition, what would be a bad composition. Then of course you submit to awards, and you look at who are the award-winning photographers and you follow them. So there was also, I think, to use the word of Clairview, right, there was also a pedagogy of copying. Right? So it's largely autodidact. There wasn't really institutionalized teaching if you're thinking about the sense of having an academy or university.
Our fellow panelist, Deng Liwen, has a question for you. In the last slide in your presentation, the ethnic Chinese photographer in Sarawak only chose exotic subject matters to photograph. Do you think this is a form of colonial gaze?
Well, I think I guess this is a very interesting question, and there is a long history and a long answer to this question, because if we actually trace the whole, let's say, use of photography in Southeast Asia since the colonial period, you would see a kind of like, let's say, a ongoing thread of photographing the indigenous people. So there is definitely a connection with the context of colonization in Southeast Asia. And so that's clearly a valid point. I think a lot of people have done a lot of work, especially from the perspective of cultural studies and also maybe from art history. But I would also want to say that right now, probably we have to move beyond just taking that position and to think about how would the indigenous people who are being photographed, or the descendants of the indigenous people who were being photographed, how would they look at these images today? How would they use the images today? And how would they recontextualize those images? So I think that's actually a part where I think we need a bit more work. So what I'm trying to say in short is I'm wary of speaking on behalf of the indigenous people in Southeast Asia and to say that this is exotic or not. Because on one level it is, but I would also be really interested in how they would see these images today, and how actually their forefathers or their ancestors experience photography. So I don't really want to erase that experience as well.
Another question. Can you say a little bit more about the print run for the periodicals that you discussed? Also, what would have been the exhibition opportunities for photographers who were working in this period?
I don't have the numbers for the print run. Yeah, because these numbers were not really, at least I haven't seen the numbers, so I can't say. Exhibition opportunities, typically what happens is that, so that's also one of the key reasons why salon photography was really the main orthodoxy of photography at that time, because typically it was the photo clubs, the amateur photo clubs, because of their strong connection with patronage, with the colonial authorities and with the national authorities, that they enjoy the opportunities of exhibiting. So in order for you to exhibit as a photographer, you would typically have to be closely or loosely involved with salon photographers, or with salon photography, with the photo clubs, because they were the ones that typically had the opportunities of mounting. And what they do usually is similar to what we have already seen, right? They would run a contest, pick the winners, and then very often they would have an exhibition. And if not, they would print it in a periodical like that. And that's how your work got disseminated at that point in time.
Wubin, I was wondering, in your survey of the periodicals, did you see work by women photographers? And do we know anything about any of them in terms of you know, their careers, their circulations?
Unfortunately, salon photography is, well, it remains to this day to be quite male-oriented, straight man-oriented, I should actually say. So there were some women Chinese photographers who were involved in salon photography, but the overwhelming majority were were male photographers. So of course there is always a kind of gender imbalance when we research about salon photography, or even photography in Southeast Asia in the 50s to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. However, I would like to propose that, if you remember the diagram that I brought out right at the start in relation to what is photography, right? I think we should stop thinking about photography through the lens of the photographers. Because once we stop giving premium to the photographers, right, and we think about the people who sit in front of the camera, who were being photographed, then you will see that the experience of photography could be rewritten as overwhelmingly female, because a lot of women were the models who appear in front of the camera. So that in that way we might be able to change the question and turn it around and say that photography was actually also strongly well, you can write a different account of photography from that female perspective. Not to say that that perspective is not problematic, but we could attempt to do that in a different way. So instead of just focusing primarily on the male photographers, the predominantly male photographers.
And is that something that you're doing? Like, how would you approach that in terms of research? What sources would you use to offer that perspective?
So I think we just, this is actually something that's actually ongoing. The difficult challenge, of course, is that a lot of the what we have now would typically be accounts of photographers. We don't really have that many accounts, or at least I'm not aware of many accounts of the people who sat for photography. There are some, and I'm trying to collate them. So the challenge always is to find the relevant sources. And I think we have to be a bit more creative in terms of looking in different directions and trying to find all these sources. And then we might be able to begin to kind of construct the experiences of the woman who appeared in front of the lens.
What are some of those sources? Are they newspapers, diaries, letters?
I think actually, there's a class of material that I'm really interested in, which is literary writings, especially autobiography and yeah, writings by women. Occasionally, they actually mention photography. So I'm at the stage of assembling materials and locating materials. Yeah.
We have a follow-up from the person who asked about the exhibition opportunities. So the person said, so in other words, there was no gallery system serving the photographers or museums.
Okay, this is not a, I cannot say, so this is a completely separate research, and it's not so simple. So what happened was that there are different developments in different, so that, I mean, Southeast Asia is, we should not think of Southeast Asia as one homogeneous region, because there are differences in terms of the developments of art and photography. I would just say that, for instance, in the Philippines in the 50s, let's say something like the Philippine Art Gallery was already exhibiting photography. Of course, they were also exhibiting, you know, painting, sculpture, even architecture. And they also made space for photography, and it opened up a kind of like modernist gallery system. And I would actually argue that because of something like PAG in Manila, right, in the 50s, actually it helped to erode the impact of salon photography in the Philippines. Because no longer, I mean, the photographers no longer had to rely on the salon clubs to get exhibition opportunities. If they are good enough, if they were good enough, they could actually go to PAG, they could go to Benkep's gallery. In fact, Benkep also had a gallery that exhibited occasionally photography. So there was some level of, I mean, there were some opportunities available in the 50s in the Philippines that went beyond salon photography. But if you come to Singapore, right, very often it had to go through Singapore, Malaya. You had to go through the salon clubs. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up for now. Zhuang Wubin, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
Thanks.